Hey everyone, welcome back to my podcast, Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. This is your host, Dr. Steve Sullivan, coming to you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, not far from Philadelphia. And that's where I've been teaching A&P since 2002. Today's episode is all about nutrition, the physiological basics of nutrition. Essentially, I want to go over all the things necessary to understand metabolism, which will be the next couple of episodes. Here's the thing, there is so much disinformation out there about nutrition and diet. The vast majority of it is marketing. People are trying to sell you quick fixes for your health and wellness, but I'm not here to do that. I am here to help you understand the basics of what we need to eat and drink, and what our bodies do with that. That's all. There is way more to nutrition than what I am going to say, but this is a great start for those of you who want to take a deeper dive with someone more qualified than I am on the topic. Once again, thanks for listening, and if you like what you hear, please take a minute to rate and review the show. Tell your friends, tell your professors, tell your classmates. I would really appreciate that. Now, when it comes to nutrition and the digestive tract, you really can't avoid hearing about gluten. And recently, I got an email from Sharon, who is a pre-nursing student just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States. Sharon asked me why gluten is bad and what is celiac disease. Well, thank you for your question, Sharon. I hope you're doing well, and I look forward to you being a nurse someday soon. So I want to take some time to answer Sharon's question. First, gluten isn't bad unless you have a sensitivity to it. One form of gluten sensitivity is celiac disease, which occurs in about 1% of the population in the United States. So since we just finished the digestive system and we're about to talk about nutrition, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about celiac disease and gluten. Celiac disease is a chronic, immune-mediated disorder that primarily affects the small intestine and is triggered by dietary exposure to gluten. Gluten is a protein found in wheat, barley, and rye. It's an important condition to understand not only for its gastrointestinal implications, but also for its systemic effects and potential to mimic other diseases. We're going to start with the pathophysiology of celiac disease. Again, it's an autoimmune disease of the small intestine that occurs in genetically predisposed individuals in response to gluten. Once again, gluten is a protein found in wheat, barley, and rye. The main component of gluten that triggers the immune response is gliadin, which resists complete digestion in the gastrointestinal tract. In individuals with celiac disease, ingestion of gliadin leads to an inappropriate immune response. There's actually some key steps in this pathophysiology, so let's go over those real quick. The first one is gliadin crosses the intestinal epithelium, often by increased intestinal permeability. In the lamina propria, the enzyme tissue transglutaminase deaminates gliadin peptides, making them more immunogenic. Deamination means an amino group, NH2, is removed from the molecule. These deaminated peptides are presented by antigen-presenting cells. You can go back to my immune episodes to learn more about those. This activates specific T cells, CD4 plus T cells, which release inflammatory cytokines and trigger an immune-mediated destruction of the small intestinal mucosa. Antibodies that target our own enzymes are also produced, making it difficult to perform normal digestive processes. This immune response leads to atrophy of the villi in the digestive tract, an increase in size in the intestinal crypts, and a loss of brush border enzymes in the proximal small intestine, specifically the duodenum and jejunum, which are primarily responsible for nutrient absorption. Now, celiac disease has a wide range of clinical presentations, from classical gastrointestinal symptoms to subtle extraintestinal findings, or no symptoms at all. So let's talk about the gastrointestinal symptoms first. You're going to have chronic diarrhea, bulky, foul-smelling, oily stools, abdominal bloating and discomfort, weight loss, failure to thrive in children, and malabsorption symptoms such as fatigue due to iron deficiency anemia. Now, things that happen outside the digestive tract is, one, that iron deficiency anemia, osteopenia and osteoporosis due to vitamin D and calcium malabsorption, Dermatitis, that's inflammation of your skin, ulcers in your digestive tract, neurological symptoms like peripheral neuropathies, depression, even epilepsy. And you can also have reproductive issues like delayed menarche, which means the onset of the menstrual cycle is delayed. You can have infertility or recurring miscarriages. Celiac has a strong association with other autoimmune disorders, including type 1 diabetes mellitus, autoimmune thyroiditis, inflammation of the thyroid gland, autoimmune hepatitis, inflammation of the liver, and selective immunoglobulin A deficiency. Now, in order to diagnose celiac, you have to do a few different things. Mostly, it's going to start with blood tests followed by a biopsy to confirm the diagnosis from the blood test. Specifically, the blood tests are looking for certain immunoglobulins. The most sensitive and specific test is for an immunoglobulin that targets the enzyme tissue transglutaminase. That immunoglobulin or antibody is called anti-TTG immunoglobulin A. The TTG stands for tissue transglutaminase. They're also going to test for immunoglobulin A deficiency, which is often found with celiac. Then they're going to do a biopsy. The biopsy is done through endoscopy, which is when a camera is inserted down your esophagus and into the small intestine, and then they'll do a biopsy on an area of the distal duodenum. What they're going to look for down there is atrophy of the villi, increased size of intestinal crypts, like we mentioned earlier, and an increased number of lymphocytes in the epithelium. Now, here's the weird thing. When you do these biopsies and you do these blood tests, you want the person to keep eating gluten because you want to see the effects. If they stop consuming gluten for weeks or so, then you're not going to have anything to look for because they won't be experiencing the effects of gluten. And then finally, what do you do if you have it? So the only effective treatment is a lifelong strict gluten-free diet. This means complete avoidance of wheat, barley, rye, and any products that are derived from them. Most patients will experience symptomatic improvement within weeks, and the mucosa of the small intestine will begin healing within months to a year. Now, if the person is experiencing some serious deficiencies because of the celiac, then you might want to use supplements like iron, calcium, vitamin D, and folate just to correct those deficiencies. And then you're going to repeat the blood tests over time, periodically, to monitor compliance, to make sure that the patient is actually doing the diet they're supposed to be doing, and to check and make sure that the mucosa is healing. If someone has celiac disease and does not do anything about it, you could be looking at severe malnutrition. You could be looking at a slowing of growth in children. You could be looking at ulcerative jejunoileitis, which means you're going to have ulcers in the jejunum and the ileum of the small intestine. And you could have an increased risk of cancer in the small intestine. So to wrap it up with celiac disease, it is a chronic autoimmune condition with systemic implications. It presents on a spectrum from silent malabsorption to severe enteropathy, which means pathology of the small intestine. And it affects not only the gut, but also the skin, the nervous system, and the bones. As future clinicians, which most of you I think are, or current clinicians, it's crucial to maintain a high index of suspicion, especially in patients with unexplained anemia, fatigue, osteoporosis, or coexisting autoimmune conditions. With early diagnosis and lifelong gluten avoidance, patients can expect complete recovery of symptoms and have a totally normal quality of life. Okay, I hope that answers your question, Sharon. Thank you so much for writing and asking about that. This is something real big. You see gluten-free and gluten all over products and packages all over the place. Remember, gluten by itself is not a bad thing. It's really only if the individual has a gluten sensitivity issue like celiac. So let's not waste any time. It's time to talk about nutrition. We got a lot to talk about, and we're going to start with body weight and energy balance. Nutrition is about consuming the food that is necessary for our cells to perform their functions, repair our tissues, and allow them to grow. When our cells can't or don't do their jobs, our health suffers. Nutrition is getting the right amount of energy in our diet, but also the right nutrients. We'll discuss this in more detail later, but there are two categories of nutrients based on the quantities our bodies require. Macronutrients are those we need in large quantities like water, protein, carbohydrates, and fats, while micronutrients like vitamins and minerals are the ones we need in smaller quantities. Vitamin C, calcium, sodium, potassium, etc. Often discussions of nutrition lead to body weight, weight loss, and weight gain. With good reason, being clinically overweight does make us more susceptible to diseases like heart disease, diabetes, and some cancers. Body weight is determined by energy balance. If we take in more energy than we spend, we tend to gain weight. If we spend more than we take in, we tend to lose weight. Our body weight usually remains pretty stable over our adult years. There seems to be like a homeostatic set point that varies from person to person. Body weight results from a combination of hereditary and environmental influences. In fact, about 30 to 55% of the variation in weight from person to person is due to heredity. Eating and exercise habits explain the rest. Calories are the units we use for energy in our food and our activities. I'll get more specific about the use of the word calorie later, but for now, I'm just going to say calories. You take in calories from food and drink, and you spend calories with activity. That activity is a combination of your body's metabolism and your actual physical activity. We'll talk about metabolic rate, which is basically the rate at which your cells use energy to do their work throughout a typical day, later on. Even our gut microbiome influences our use of nutrients and our body weight. So let's talk about weight control for a bit. The struggle for weight control is centered around what we eat and how much of it. Exercise is also a key component, not only for energy expenditure, but because exercise has many health benefits. But consider this. The average person will burn about 100 calories running a mile. Work requires energy, and work is defined as force times distance. So the force you exert over a distance is the work you are doing. That means walking a mile burns essentially the same number of calories as running it. You're traveling the same distance. You're just doing it faster. Notice that time is not in the equation for work. Now, running for an hour burns more calories than walking for an hour because you're covering more distance. So let's compare that 100 calories in 1 mile to food. According to the McDonald's website, a Big Mac has 580 calories. Large French fries have 480 calories. And a medium Coca-Cola has 200. So that's a grand total of 1,260 calories for a Big Mac, large fries, and a medium Coke. You'd have to run almost a half marathon to burn those calories off. So while exercise is important for energy balance and tons of other health reasons, like cardiovascular health, mental health, insulin sensitivity, and others, the quality and quantity of food is the main cause of energy imbalance. This does not mean food is the enemy. Good quality food is essential for health, and an occasional fast food meal or sweet treat is totally fine. The issue is excess. Enjoy yourself, enjoy your food, but watch out for excesses of energy-dense, low-quality foods like fast food, for example. So let's talk about appetite, which is essentially how hungry we feel and how much we end up eating. There is a still growing list of peptide hormones and regulatory pathways that control short and long-term appetite and body weight. Some of these hormones are called gut-brain peptides because 1, they're protein-based hormones, so peptide, and 2, they act as chemical agents that go back and forth between the gastrointestinal tract and the brain, sending signals. So let's talk about some of them, keeping in mind that there is a lot of research still happening on this, and this information is likely to change as we learn more. We'll start with the ones that work quickly, over periods of minutes to hours. We call them short-term regulators of appetite. They make you feel hungry, so you start to eat, Then they make you feel full or satiated, so you stop eating. The word satiated means you've eaten enough. You feel satisfied. Okay, the first gut-brain peptide is ghrelin. It is secreted by the parietal cells in the fundus of the stomach, especially when the stomach is empty. It makes you feel hungry and stimulates the hypothalamus to secrete growth hormone-releasing hormone in anticipation of absorbing nutrients in a meal. The subsequent growth hormone released from the anterior pituitary can take advantage of those nutrients and stimulate cellular activity. Ghrelin secretion stops within an hour after eating. Peptide YY, or PYY, is secreted by enteroendocrine cells in the ileum of the small intestine and the colon of the large intestine long before the chyme reaches the ileum. The cool thing is that the ileum and the colon can tell when food enters the stomach, and the amount of PYY secreted is proportional to the calories we consumed. PYY signals satiety, so we stop eating. That means ghrelin is one of the signals that begins a meal, and PYY is one of the signals that ends it. PYY remains elevated well after a meal. It acts as that ileal brake I discussed in episode 62, so it slows down gastric emptying, making us feel full longer. Cholecystokinin, which we call CCK, is secreted by enteroendocrine cells in the duodenum and the jejunum of the small intestine. As we know from previous episodes, it stimulates bile and pancreatic enzyme secretion. It also stimulates the brain and sensory fibers of the vagus nerves, producing an appetite-suppressing effect. That means we don't feel hungry, so we stop eating. Amylin is secreted by the beta cells of the pancreatic islets, like insulin. And, like PYY and CCK, produces a feeling of satiety. Amylin also stimulates the beginning of the end of the stomach's digestive activity. So ghrelin makes you feel hungry, and PYY, CCK, and amylin make you feel full. So that's peptide YY, cholecystokinin, and amylin. There are also long-term regulators of appetite, metabolic rate, and body weight governing our average rate of caloric intake and energy expenditure for weeks or even years. We'll discuss the peptides that act as adiposity signals. This means they let the brain know how much adipose tissue the body has and activate mechanisms for adding or reducing fat. The first one is leptin. Leptin is secreted by adipocytes throughout the body and is the brain's primary way of knowing how much fat we have. Leptin stimulates sympathetic nerve fibers to secrete norepinephrine, which stimulates fat breakdown called lipolysis. There may be a tendency to think that obesity could be caused by a leptin deficiency because leptin is an appetite inhibitor. But in humans, that doesn't seem to be the case. There is more likely a receptor issue than there is a leptin issue. Insulin is secreted by the pancreatic beta cells. As discussed in the endocrine episodes, insulin stimulates glucose and amino acid uptake and promotes glycogen and fat synthesis. This means it lowers the blood sugar and promotes a storage of glucose and amino acids. But it also has receptors in the brain and, like leptin, lets the brain know about our adipose quantity. It has a weaker effect on appetite than leptin, however. An important brain center for appetite regulation is the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus. The arcuate nucleus has receptors for both leptin and insulin. It also has two neural networks involved in hunger. One group secretes neuropeptide Y, or NPY, a potent appetite stimulant making us feel hungry. The other secretes melanocortin, which inhibits eating. NPY secretion is stimulated by ghrelin, whereas insulin, PYY, and leptin inhibit NPY secretion. Leptin also stimulates melanocortin secretion and inhibits the secretion of appetite stimulants called endocannabinoids, named for their resemblance to THC found in marijuana. THC is an appetite stimulant. Now, there's more to appetite regulation than gut-brain peptides. Mild hunger contractions of the stomach's muscularis externum muscles begin soon after the stomach empties and increase in intensity over a period of hours. While they are an incentive to eat, they don't influence the amount of food we eat. You'll notice that just chewing and swallowing some food will briefly satisfy your appetite, but it doesn't last. Ultimately, your long-term appetite is suppressed based on the absorption of nutrients into the blood. So it's not just about the amount of food we eat, it's also about the kind of food we eat, because the total nutrients we need are only found in a variety of foods. In humans, different neurotransmitters also seem to control the appetite for different nutrients. For example, norepinephrine stimulates the appetite for carbohydrates, ghrelin for fatty foods, and endorphins for proteins. Okay, so let's talk about calories. Physiologically, a calorie is a measure of the capacity to do biological work. 1 calorie is the amount of heat that will raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. 1,000 calories is called a calorie with a capital C in dietetics and a kilocalorie in biochemistry and physiology. Just about all the calories we consume come from carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. These 3 macronutrients vary even among themselves. Depending on the source, one carbohydrate can be different from another in their digestibility and the number of calories they have. When completely oxidized, on average, various carbohydrates yield about 3.9 kilocalories per gram. Proteins average about 3.8 kilocalories per gram, and fats average about 8.7 kilocalories per gram. So fats have a little more than twice the number of calories per gram than carbohydrates and proteins. Alcohol has about 7.1 kilocalories per gram. Alcohol and sugary foods can lead to malnutrition because while they suppress the appetite with empty calories, they lack other nutrients the body requires. If you want to eat a healthy diet, you need to consume complex foods that not only meet the need for calories, but also proteins, lipids, vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients. The energy we get from our food is usually used to make ATP, which then transfers the energy to our physiological processes. Okay, now let's discuss nutrients. A nutrient is any ingested chemical that's absorbed into the tissues and used for growth, repair, or maintenance of the body. Earlier, I mentioned the 6 major classes of nutrients. They are water, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, minerals, and vitamins. We measure dietary requirements in terms of grams per day for macronutrients, but only milligrams to micrograms per day for micronutrients. With some exceptions, the body can synthesize a lot of nutrients if we're not getting them from our diet. This excludes all minerals, most vitamins, 8 of the 20 amino acids, and some fatty acids. These are called essential nutrients because it's essential we consume them since our body cannot synthesize them. Let's talk about the recommended daily intake of macronutrients. I'm going to follow the guidance of the U.S. National Academy of Medicine. The Academy uses the term recommended dietary allowance when there are enough sound data to say what intake should meet the needs of 97% or more of biological men and women in a given age group. When there aren't enough data to confidently make that determination, we use the term adequate intake, which is the daily consumption thought to meet the needs of people in a given age range. There's also a category called dietary reference intakes, which include recommendations for infants, children, and pregnant or lactating women. It also advises on the upper limits of nutrients that may be toxic in high quantities, like iron or vitamin D. I will post a link in the show notes to where you can find all of them on the U.S. National Institutes of Health website. Having said that, let's discuss each class of macronutrient. Carbohydrates exist in our bodies as circulating blood glucose, commonly known as blood sugar, and the starch glycogen, which is our storage form of glucose. On average, we have about 450 or so grams of carbohydrate in us, less than 5% of which is blood glucose. About 70% is muscle glycogen, and 25% is liver glycogen. If you recall from episodes 3, 4, and 5, sugars can be components of other molecules. When you see the prefix glyco or the suffix glycan, it means that there is a sugar component. Examples are glycoproteins, like mucins and some water-soluble hormones, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, human growth hormone. Those are some examples. Glycoproteins means there is a sugar and a protein in one molecule. Glycolipids are a sugar and a lipid, like the ones in our plasma membranes that act as cell identity markers. In fact, the glycocalyx consists of glycoproteins, proteoglycans, and glycolipids. ATP and RNA both have ribose in their molecular structure, which is a 5-carbon simple sugar. Its formula is C5H10O5. Deoxyribose is also a 5-carbon simple sugar, but with one fewer oxygen atom than ribose. Deoxy means we removed an oxygen. Makes sense, right? C5H10O4. And you know DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, so we need sugar and other carbohydrates for all these essential physiological components. Sugars can also be converted to amino acids and fats. Having said that, we utilize most of the body's carbohydrate to synthesize ATP, our main and simplest source of chemical energy. That's not to say we can't also get energy from proteins and fats, but the most efficient and least taxing source is carbohydrates. In fact, most cells meet their energy needs from a combination of carbohydrates and fats. However, it's important to point out that some very important cells like neurons and erythrocytes depend almost exclusively on carbohydrates for their energy. Think about it. What are your first symptoms when you feel your blood sugar is low? Lightheadedness, dizzy, headache, maybe you get a little shaky? These are neurological symptoms because neurons, especially in the brain, rely on blood sugar for energy. I could rehash all the details of hormonal control of blood sugar, but the bottom line is when blood sugar is high, we increase our glycogen stores. When it's low, we break glycogen down into glucose and release it into the blood. I detailed all this in episode 37, which covers the pancreas from an endocrine perspective. If you go back and review episode 37, you'll hear all about insulin and glucagon and their control of blood sugar. I highly recommend doing that. And take notes if you've got an exam coming up. This is important stuff. The inability to control blood sugar due to low insulin levels or low insulin receptors is diabetes mellitus, which affects about 15% of people in the United States, and it is one of the top 10 causes of death in the world. Blood glucose is measured in milligrams of glucose per deciliter of blood. A normal blood glucose level is considered to be from 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. Not only do we convert carbohydrates to fat when we have too much, but when we don't have enough, we oxidize fat to meet our metabolic energy needs. This is why eating too much starch and sugary foods greatly influences body weight. I'm sure you've heard of extremely low carbohydrate diets as a way to reduce body fat. And on the surface, that seems like a good idea. However, the complete and efficient oxidation of fats relies on adequate carbohydrate intake and the presence of certain intermediates of carbohydrate metabolism. Without them, fats are incompletely oxidized to ketone bodies. Ketones are acidic and can lower the pH of our body fluids, a condition called metabolic acidosis. You remember from our early episodes, acids denature proteins, like our enzymes, our hormones, and receptors, for example. We don't want to break those down. So while reducing carbs to a reasonable amount will help lose weight, zero carbohydrate diets can be dangerous. So what are our carbohydrate requirements? Well, carbohydrates are much more rapidly oxidized than proteins and fats. So with the exception of water, we need them in greater amounts than any other nutrient. The RDA, the recommended dietary allowance for biological males and females, is about 130 grams per day. 120 grams of glucose per day is consumed by the brain. According to the National Academy of Medicine, the average person should get about 40 to 50% of their calories from carbohydrates, 60% for highly active people. However, no more than 25% of your daily calories should come from added sugars. Added sugars are the sugars that do not occur naturally in food. For example, fruit naturally has fructose in it. That's a naturally occurring sugar. But Fruit Loops, the breakfast cereal, does not. So sugar is added to it to make it sweet. That sugar is likely sucrose, which we call table sugar. That is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. Or it might be high fructose corn syrup, which is 45% glucose and 55% fructose. Other examples of foods with added sugar are ice cream, candy, non-diet soft drinks like cola, root beer, or lemon lime sodas, sweet tea, energy drinks, cakes, cookies, pastries, etc. In the United States, we have vastly increased our carbohydrate consumption over the last 100 years or so. This is mainly because of the increased use of sugar in ultra-processed foods. In the 1920s, the average American diet consisted of just under 2 kilograms of sugar per year. That's about 4.5 pounds. In the 2020s, thanks to the sucrose and high fructose corn syrup in processed foods, soft drinks, and sweets, that number has skyrocketed to 27 kilograms of sucrose and 21 kilograms of corn syrup per year. That is a total of 48 kilograms of sugar, which is 105 pounds. 24 times as much as we consumed just 100 years ago. Think about this. There's about 38 grams of sugar in a 12-ounce can of Coca-Cola. If you drank 1 Coke per day, you'd be consuming almost 14 kilograms of sugar per year just from that. 1 Coke per day is 7 times as much sugar as all the sugar a person consumed in 1920. Now consider the level of physical activity of people in the 1920s versus the 2020s. Cars were not universal. People walked or bicycled. And the majority of jobs in the 1920s were manual labor jobs like farming, manufacturing, and trades. Today, those jobs are the minority, with sedentary jobs being a large portion of the American workforce. Increased caloric consumption combined with decreased physical activity results in much higher rates of obesity-related illness. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, obesity rates among American adults have risen from about 13% in the 1960s to about 40% in 2023. Back in episode 61, I discussed the different forms of dietary carbohydrates that we digest in our gut, but I'll review a bit here. There are 3 principal forms: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides like starches, glycogen, and cellulose. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to polysaccharides as complex carbohydrates. The only nutritionally significant polysaccharide is starch. There's very little glycogen in our food, and cellulose isn't considered a nutrient because we don't digest it and it doesn't get absorbed. However, it is still important to us as a dietary fiber. Okay, let's break down the mono and disaccharides. The monosaccharides are glucose, galactose, and fructose. They're all C6H12O6, but each molecule is arranged differently. Disaccharides are simple sugars consisting of 2 monosaccharides bound together. The disaccharides are sucrose, table sugar, lactose, milk sugar, and maltose, malt sugar. I mentioned the makeup of sucrose earlier: glucose and fructose. Lactose is glucose and galactose. Maltose is glucose and glucose. Malt sugar is found in things like germinating seeds, beer, bread, and breakfast cereals. It's not super sweet. The small intestine and liver convert fructose and galactose to glucose. So ultimately, all carbohydrate digestion generates glucose. I'll bet you've heard of the glycemic index, which is how a carbohydrate will affect your blood sugar. Let's talk about that for a minute. The glycemic index of a food is relative to the effect that ingesting 50 grams of glucose has on your blood glucose level over the next 2 hours. We'll call that 100, and everything else is based on that. Greater than or equal to 70 is considered a high glycemic index, which means those carbs are quickly digested and absorbed and raise blood sugar in a very short period of time. Foods with a high glycemic index are white bread, white rice, sugary drinks, some fruits like watermelon and pineapple, sugary things like candy, cake, and pastries, white potatoes, sugary breakfast cereals, corn, crackers, pretzels, all that kind of stuff. Generally, highly processed foods, and those with a lot of sugar, tend to have a high glycemic index. Since they raise the blood sugar so quickly, they stimulate a high insulin demand and raise the risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes mellitus. Carbohydrates with a low glycemic index, like 55 and lower, are digested more slowly, so blood sugar rises more gradually. These include the carbohydrates found in most fruits, like apples, bananas, that are not overripe, strawberries, blueberries, oranges, pears, plums, peaches, apricots, and grapefruit. Most green vegetables, like broccoli, spinach, kale, lettuce, and other vegetables, like carrots, tomatoes, asparagus, and sweet potatoes. Also, whole grains, beans, and other legumes, nuts, seeds, and dairy products Also, dark chocolate and avocado. These are all low glycemic index foods. Now, the tricky part is that the glycemic index isn't 100% consistent. It can vary from person to person by the time of day you eat and by how you prepare the food. When it comes to carbohydrates, it's best to limit the amount of simple sugars you consume because they don't typically come with other nutrients like vitamins and minerals. For the most part, we get those when we consume our carbohydrates in the form of whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. Okay, earlier I mentioned fiber, which we typically get from the indigestible cellulose and pectin in the plants we eat. These are both components of a plant's cell wall. So let's talk more about dietary fiber. Even though it's not considered a nutrient, we absolutely need fiber in our diet. In fact, the recommendation is about 25 grams for biological females and 38 grams for biological males. There are two types of fiber we consume: water-soluble and water-insoluble. Water-soluble fiber includes pectin from fruits and vegetables, as well as other carbohydrates found in oats, beans, lentils, peas, carrots, brown rice apples, citrus fruits, avocados, bananas, barley, and psyllium. Psyllium, by the way, is found in the seed husks of the Plantago ovata plant. It's often used to help alleviate constipation because it absorbs intestinal water, adding bulk to feces so it's easier to pass. It's also a good food for the beneficial bacteria in our gut's microbiome. Water-soluble fiber reduces total blood cholesterol and, more importantly, low-density lipoproteins, which we're going to talk about later. That's the bad cholesterol that contributes to coronary artery disease. Cellulose is a water-insoluble fiber. It doesn't lower cholesterol, but like psyllium, it absorbs water and swells, helping ease bowel movements. Okay, that's enough about carbs. Now let's get into lipids, also known as fats. Okay, lipids. Lipids are hugely important. Fat is not necessarily bad in our diet, but we should talk about our body composition. A healthy percent body fat is up to 25% for biological males and up to 30% for biological females. Fat accounts for most of the body's stored energy. It also contributes phospholipids and cholesterol to the plasma membrane and myelin to our axons. Fat is a more compact energy storage substance than carbohydrates. It contains over twice as much energy as carbohydrates, like I said earlier. Almost 9 kilocalories per gram of fat compared to about 4 for carbohydrates. Using fat for energy in most of our cells means we are not breaking down proteins and we're leaving glucose available for neurons and erythrocytes, which cannot use fat for energy. So that's good. Without fat in the diet, we can't absorb vitamins A, D, E, and K because they're lipid-soluble vitamins. That means they can't be absorbed by the small intestine unless there is fat for them to dissolve in. You can actually cause a vitamin deficiency by excessively restricting your fat intake. Phospholipids and cholesterol are major structural components of plasma membranes and myelin. Cholesterol, which is a lipid, is vital to the synthesis of steroid hormones, bile acids, prostaglandins, eicosanoids, and vitamin D. Lipids are also essential for blood clotting, and not to mention adipose tissue helps protect our organs and provides insulation so we don't lose our body heat. So don't think of fats as bad. We need fat. Fat is good. It's just that we need to limit how much of it we consume, and we need to watch the kinds of fat we consume. And since I brought that up, how much? We should limit our fat intake to about 35% of our daily calories. Less than 10% should be saturated fats, which are typically fats that are solid at room temperature. These are mostly found in animal products like eggs, milk, cheese, and meat, but we also see it as coconut oil. And there are also hydrogenated plant oils that are made to be spreadable fats like margarine and vegetable shortening. These are called trans fats. Unsaturated fats are typically liquid at room temperature and consist of plant oils like olive oil, canola oil, avocado oil, nut oils, seed oils, and corn oil. But we can hydrogenate oils to make them saturated even if they are unsaturated plant oils. Too much saturated and unsaturated fats is a risk factor for diabetes mellitus, coronary artery disease, and breast and colon cancer. The largest source of cholesterol in our diet is egg yolks. However, when we think of our blood cholesterol levels, dietary cholesterol is not really a big culprit. Only about 20% of those levels come from cholesterol we consume as actual cholesterol. 80% comes from the bile acids we produce in the liver to emulsify the saturated fats in our diet. In fact, cholesterol-free trans fats are known to raise blood cholesterol more than cholesterol itself. Just like we have essential amino acids, we also have essential fatty acids. We can't make them ourselves, so we have to eat them. These include linoleic acid, and according to some, linolenic and arachidonic acids. Typical diets in the Western Hemisphere contain plenty of these essential fatty acids, so we don't really have to worry about it.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to Bombas.com and use code AUDIO for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com and use code AUDIO at checkout.
Lowe's knows you've got a job to do, and we help get it done. With the MyLowe's Pro Rewards program, eligible members save more with volume discounts on qualifying orders through a quote of $2,000 or more. Join for free today. Lowe's, we help, you save. Offer can't be combined with any other discount, contract, and/or special pricing. Exclusions, more terms, and restrictions apply. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
Okay, I think this episode is getting a little long, and packing all of the nutrition into one episode just may be too much. So I'm going to pick this discussion up in the next episode, beginning with how we transport lipids in our blood. And we'll cover proteins and micronutrients as well. Once again, thank you, Sharon from Minnesota, for your question about gluten and celiac disease. And as always, thank you so much for listening. I hope this podcast is helping you get your B or better in A&P. Good luck. I'll talk to you next time. Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit is a production of Minus 55 Media. Don't forget to check out my Instagram account and my YouTube channel, both called Student Help for AP. I'm posting a lot of stuff on there right now that you can watch and that will hopefully really help you understand this A&P stuff. Very special thank you out to my family, Bucks County Community College, and McGraw-Hill Education, where you can find my tutor video-based textbook alternative Anatomy and Physiology digital suite, already being used by several colleges and universities throughout the United States.
Lowe's knows you've got a job to do, and we help get it done. With the MyLowe's Pro Rewards program, eligible members save more with volume discounts on qualifying orders through a quote of $2,000 or more. Join for free today. Lowe's, we help, you save. Offer can't be combined with any other discount, contract, and/or special pricing. Exclusions, more terms, and restrictions apply. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.